Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of Blackwood County, New York. Before we begin, I ask that you write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. We also ask that you subscribe by clicking subscribe to help us produce more documented reports like this every day. The snow fell heavily on the morning of December 23rd, 1946, blanketing the small town of Millbrook in an unnatural silence. Eleanor Winters stood at her kitchen window, watching as the last of the town's children trudged through knee-deep snow toward the community hall. Her own daughter, Catherine, had left an hour earlier, clutching the small cloth bag that contained her ceremonial clothes. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she dried the breakfast dishes, her eyes never leaving the distant spire of the hall as smoke began to rise from its chimney. The winter cleansing ceremony would begin at noon, as it had every year since the founding of the Society of Eternal Purity in 1873. What made Eleanor's heart race wasn't the ceremony itself. It was what she had found the night before, hidden between the pages of Reverend Morris's private journal. A truth that threatened to unravel 70 years of tradition and faith. A truth about what really happened to the children marked as vessels of impurity. The Winters family had been respected members of Millbrook since its establishment as a religious community in the hills of upstate New York. Eleanor's grandfather, Thomas Winters, had been one of the original 7 families who followed Reverend Silas Morris from Massachusetts after his excommunication from the Presbyterian Church for what church elders called extreme interpretations of purification rituals. The small group had purchased 500 acres of forested land and established their community far from prying eyes, building homes, a school, and the imposing stone community hall that served as their place of worship. By 1946, Millbrook had grown to 38 families, all descendants of the original settlers or carefully selected converts who embraced the society's belief in physical and spiritual purity. Life in Millbrook followed a structured routine. The men worked in the timber mill or tended to the community's agricultural needs. The women maintained the homes, educated the younger children, and preserved the society's traditions through oral histories and handwritten texts. Children were raised with strict discipline, taught from an early age about the dangers of impurity and the importance of the cleansing rituals that marked each season. The community was largely self-sufficient, venturing to neighboring towns only when necessary for supplies or medical care that couldn't be provided by the society's healer. To outsiders, Millbrook appeared simply as a reclusive religious community, somewhat old-fashioned but harmless. The few government officials who occasionally visited found nothing overtly concerning. The children were educated to state standards, though with heavy religious instruction. The homes were modest but well-maintained, and the residents polite, if reserved. What these visitors never witnessed were the ceremonies that took place behind the heavy oak doors of the community hall, particularly the winter cleansing that coincided with the winter solstice. Eleanor had participated in these ceremonies her entire life. As a child, she had stood with her peers as Reverend Morris and the elders examined each of them for signs of impurity, birthmarks in certain patterns, unusual behaviors, or any physical traits deemed marked by darkness. Most children passed through this examination with nothing more than a symbolic marking of ash on their foreheads, followed by prayers and a community feast. But each year, a small number of children were selected for deeper cleansing. These children would be separated from the others and taken to the small stone room beneath the community hall. Parents were told this cleansing required isolation and specialized rituals that might last several days. When these children returned, they were often quieter, more obedient. Some bore small scars they were forbidden to discuss. Others never returned at all. Their parents informed that the impurity had been too deeply rooted, requiring their transfer to the Society's sister community in Vermont, a place no Millbrook resident had ever visited. For decades, the people of Millbrook accepted these explanations. The Society's teachings emphasized the dangers of questioning the elders' wisdom and the spiritual consequences of allowing impurity to spread. Parents who lost children to the sister community were granted special status, their sacrifice honored with additional food rations and assistance from other families. Some whispered in private about their doubts, but none dared speak openly against the practices that had defined their community for generations. Eleanor had never questioned the rituals until Catherine was born. Her daughter came into the world during a harsh winter storm in 1935, the only child to survive out of 3 difficult pregnancies. From the moment she first held Catherine, Eleanor felt a fierce protectiveness that transcended the community's teachings. As Catherine grew, developing her father's bright red hair and a small, crescent-shaped birthmark behind her left ear, Eleanor's anxiety increased. Red hair had been noted in the Society's texts as a potential sign of impurity, a mark of fire that might indicate a child's predisposition to sinful thoughts. Eleanor had taken to carefully combing Catherine's hair to conceal the birthmark during examinations, something that filled her with guilt but which she justified as a mother's natural caution. For 11 years, Catherine had passed through the winter cleansing with nothing more than the symbolic ash mark. But in recent months, Eleanor had noticed the elders paying particular attention to her daughter. Catherine had begun asking questions during religious instruction, not out of defiance, but from genuine curiosity about the world beyond Millbrook. Reverend Morris's son, Nathaniel, who had assumed many of his aging father's duties, had twice visited their home to discuss Catherine's inquisitive spirit with Eleanor and her husband Richard. These visits left Eleanor sleepless with worry. What Eleanor discovered the previous evening had transformed that worry into terror. Richard served as one of the community's record keepers, maintaining the birth and death records, ceremonial accounts, and transcribing the aging Reverend Morris's journals. The journals were kept locked in a cedar chest in Richard's study, a room Eleanor rarely entered out of respect for her husband's private work. But Richard had fallen ill 3 days earlier with a high fever, leaving him bedridden and occasionally delirious. The evening before the winter cleansing, he had called Eleanor to his bedside, his eyes glassy with fever. "The journal," he had whispered, his voice barely audible. "December 1938, you must—" He had fallen back into a restless sleep before finishing his thought, but his words lingered in Eleanor's mind as she tended to his fever through the evening. After ensuring he was sleeping soundly, she had taken the key he kept on a chain around his neck and opened the cedar chest for the first time in their 20 years of marriage. The journal from 1938 was bound in dark leather, its pages filled with Reverend Morris's cramped handwriting. Eleanor had skimmed the entries until reaching December, unsure what Richard had wanted her to see. The entry for December 23rd detailed that year's winter cleansing, listing the names of 34 children who had received the symbolic ash mark. At the bottom of the page, separated from the others, were 3 names: Joseph Miller, age 9, Rebecca Thompson, age 7, and Samuel Wright, age 10. Beside each name was written, "Transferred for deep cleansing, impurity of questioning." Eleanor had known these children. Rebecca had been especially close to her family, her mother being Eleanor's cousin. The girl had disappeared after the ceremony, and the community had gathered to support her parents through their sacrifice. Eleanor turned the page, expecting to find details of the children's transfer to the supposed sister community. Instead, what she read froze her blood. "The vessels of impurity have been cleansed through fire. Their ashes return to the earth beneath the sacred oak. The fire burns brightest in those who question, and so it must be extinguished most thoroughly. The Miller boy required additional restraint, his impurity manifesting in violent resistance. The Thompson girl went quietly, her tears ceasing when I explained the honor of her sacrifice. The Wright boy attempted escape, but was recovered near the northern property line. All three received the prayer of purification before the cleansing fire was lit. Their parents have been told of their transfer and have accepted this with appropriate grief and honor. The community remains pure for another year. Eleanor had read the passage multiple times, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly tore the thin page. The implications were unmistakable. There was no sister community, no transfer of children for special cleansing. The children selected each year were being killed, burned alive as some twisted sacrifice to maintain what the elders considered purity. And they had been doing this for generations, with the entire community unknowingly complicit. She had carefully returned the journal to the chest, replaced the key around Richard's neck, and spent the night sitting by the window, unable to sleep as her mind raced with the horror of her discovery and the terrifying realization that Catherine might be in danger. Her daughter had been asking questions, showing the same impurity of questioning that had condemned those three children 8 years earlier. Now, as Eleanor watched the snow continue to fall, the clock on the mantel showed 11:15. The ceremony would begin in 45 minutes. Catherine was already at the hall, helping prepare the ceremonial space as the older children traditionally did. Eleanor glanced at the bedroom where Richard still slept, his fever finally broken, but leaving him too weak to attend the ceremony. She would be expected to go alone, to watch as her daughter stood before the elders for examination, to smile and participate in the feast afterward, regardless of the outcome. But Eleanor knew she could not, would not, allow her daughter to face that examination. If the elders had noticed Catherine's questioning nature, if they had seen the birthmark during earlier observations, she might already be marked for deeper cleansing. With sudden clarity, Eleanor realized why Richard had directed her to the journal. He too had discovered the truth, and even in his fever had sought to warn her before it was too late. Eleanor moved with purpose now. She took her warmest coat from the hook by the door and Richard's hunting knife from the drawer in the kitchen. She slipped the knife into her pocket and wrapped a scarf around her head before stepping out into the bitter cold. The walk to the community hall would take 20 minutes in the heavy snow. She had less than half an hour to find Catherine and escape from Millbrook before the ceremony began. The snow had slowed by the time Eleanor reached the community hall, the massive stone building looming against the grey sky. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney, and Eleanor could see lights glowing behind the stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the society's history. Reverend Morris leading his followers from persecution, the founding of Millbrook, and the first winter cleansing ceremony. Eleanor had always found the windows beautiful. Now, looking more closely at the cleansing scene, she noticed details she had overlooked, small figures surrounded by stylized flames, their faces turned upward in what she had always interpreted as rapture, but now recognized as agony. She entered through the side door, stamping snow from her boots in the small antechamber. The main hall was decorated for the ceremony with evergreen boughs and white candles. A large fire blazed in the stone fireplace at the far end, and the ceremonial stage had been set up before it. Several women were arranging the last of the decorations, while others prepared the feast in the adjacent kitchen. The children would be in the preparation room, changing into their ceremonial white robes under the supervision of the junior elders. Eleanor nodded politely to the women who acknowledged her arrival, maintaining a calm facade despite the frantic beating of her heart. She moved toward the preparation room, formulating an excuse to remove Catherine if questioned. As she passed the fireplace, she noticed Nathaniel Morris speaking quietly with two of the male elders. His eyes met hers briefly, and Eleanor forced herself to smile before looking away. Had she imagined the lingering suspicion in his gaze? The preparation room was down a short hallway, past the heavy door that Eleanor knew led to the stone staircase descending to the basement, the room where children marked for deeper cleansing were taken. The thought of that room, which she had never entered, now filled her with dread. She wondered how many children had descended those stairs over the decades, never to return to their families. Eleanor found 20 children in the preparation room, all between the ages of 7 and 15, changing into white robes or sitting quietly on benches as they waited for the ceremony to begin. 2 women, wives of elders, supervised them with stern expressions. Catherine sat in the corner, already dressed in her robe, helping a younger girl tie the ceremonial red sash around her waist. Eleanor felt a rush of relief at the sight of her daughter, still safe, still here. "Eleanor," said Martha Williams, one of the supervising women, "we weren't certain you would attend, with Richard being ill." "I wouldn't miss the ceremony," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady. But Catherine forgot her pendant. "Richard was most insistent that she wear it today, for protection against impurity." Martha nodded approvingly. "A father's concern for his daughter's purity is commendable. Take her quickly to retrieve it. The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, and Reverend Morris expects all children to be lined up before the elders by then." Eleanor beckoned to Catherine, who obediently stood and approached after helping the younger girl finish with her sash. "Come, Catherine, we must hurry home for your pendant." Catherine followed her mother from the preparation room, her expression curious but unquestioning. The girl had been raised to obey adults without hesitation, a trait that had kept her safe thus far, but which now filled Eleanor with a complex mixture of gratitude and sadness. When had the society's emphasis on obedience become a tool for controlling not just behavior, but thought itself? They passed Nathaniel Morris in the hallway. The man's cold eyes lingered on Catherine, then moved to Eleanor with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sister Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone as his father's, "the ceremony will begin shortly. Where are you taking Catherine?" Eleanor repeated the explanation about the forgotten pendant, aware of how thin the excuse sounded. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "The ceremonial dress requires no adornment," he said. "Purity needs no decoration." "It was my husband's specific request," Eleanor countered, hearing the tremor in her voice despite her efforts to appear calm. "A family heirloom blessed by your father when Catherine was born. Richard believes it will help her focus during the examination." Nathaniel considered this for a moment before nodding slightly. "See that you both return quickly. Your daughter's examination is of particular importance this year." The words sent ice through Eleanor's veins, confirming her worst fears. She nodded and guided Catherine toward the side door, fighting the urge to run. Only when they had left the building and were a dozen yards away did Eleanor change direction, steering Catherine not toward their home, but toward the path that led to the northern edge of the community. "Mother, this isn't the way home," Catherine said, confusion evident in her voice. "And why do I need my pendant? I don't remember Father saying anything about it." "Listen to me very carefully, Catherine," Eleanor said, glancing behind them to ensure they weren't being followed. "We're not going home. We're leaving Millbrook, now, today, before the ceremony." Catherine stopped walking, her young face a mask of confusion and the first hints of fear. "Leaving? But we can't leave. The ceremony is not what we've been told," Eleanor said, taking her daughter's hands. "Catherine, I need you to trust me completely right now. Your life depends on it. I'll explain everything once we're safe, but now we must hurry." Whether it was the urgency in her mother's voice or the years of conditioned obedience, Catherine nodded and continued walking, though her expression remained troubled. They moved as quickly as the deep snow would allow, taking the path that wound through the pine forest north of the community hall. Eleanor had chosen this route deliberately. Most of the community would be gathered at the hall by now, and the northern forest bordered state lands beyond the society's property. If they could reach the main road, approximately 3 miles through the forest, they might find a passing vehicle to take them to the nearest town. They had travelled perhaps half a mile when the distant sound of the ceremonial bell reached them, signalling the beginning of the winter cleansing. Eleanor quickened their pace, practically dragging Catherine through a particularly deep snowdrift. The sound of the bell would be followed by a roll call of all community members. Their absence would be noted immediately. "Mother, please," Catherine gasped, struggling to keep up. "Why are we running?" "What's happening?" Eleanor paused briefly, seeing the genuine fear in her daughter's eyes. "The ceremony isn't just a blessing, Catherine. The children who are taken for deeper cleansing never go to another community. They're—" She stopped, unable to voice the horrible truth to her 11-year-old daughter. "They're harmed, Catherine, and I believe they plan to take you today." Catherine's eyes widened. "But why would they hurt children?" "Reverend Morris says the society protects children from the impurity of the outside world." "I believe Reverend Morris and the elders are not what they claim to be," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. "Your father discovered this too. That's why we must leave, find help, and perhaps save other children." A shout from the direction of the community hall interrupted their conversation. Eleanor turned to see distant figures emerging from the building, several carrying lanterns, despite the daylight. The alarm had been raised more quickly than she had anticipated. "They're coming," she whispered, gripping Catherine's hand tightly. "We need to run now. Follow me and stay close." They abandoned the path, plunging deeper into the forest where the pine trees grew close together, providing some cover from pursuers. The snow was shallower here, but roots and underbrush made the terrain difficult. Eleanor had only a vague idea of the direction to the main road, having rarely ventured this far from the community. She oriented herself by the weak winter sun, barely visible through the clouds, and continued northward. The distant shouts grew more organized, suggesting the search party had found their tracks where they left the path. Eleanor estimated they had perhaps a 15-minute head start, but the searchers, likely younger men from the community, would move faster than a woman and child struggling through unfamiliar forest. After nearly an hour of difficult travel, Catherine was beginning to flag, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The temperature was dropping as afternoon gave way to early evening, and neither of them was dressed for extended exposure. Eleanor herself felt the bite of cold through her coat, and Catherine wore only her indoor clothes beneath a winter coat, hastily grabbed as they fled. They needed shelter, but more importantly, they needed to throw off their pursuers. "Listen," Eleanor said, stopping behind a large pine. In the distance, they could hear voices and the occasional snap of a branch. "They're spreading out to find our trail. We need to be smarter than them." Catherine nodded, her face pale with cold and fear, but her eyes determined. Eleanor felt a surge of pride in her daughter's resilience. Despite years of the society's conditioning, Catherine had accepted her mother's words and followed her into the unknown without further question. Perhaps the impurity of questioning that had marked her for cleansing was actually the natural intelligence that Eleanor had always quietly nurtured. "There's a stream not far ahead," Eleanor said, remembering details of the land from community hunting expeditions her husband had described. "If we can reach it and walk along the water for a while, it will hide our tracks." They moved forward more cautiously now, stopping frequently to listen for pursuers. The weak daylight was fading, making navigation increasingly difficult. Just as Eleanor feared they had become completely disoriented, they heard the sound of running water. The stream was partially frozen, but still flowed in the center, cutting a winding path through the forest. Eleanor and Catherine carefully made their way down the slippery bank and began walking in the shallow water near the edge. The cold was shocking, immediately numbing their feet, but Eleanor knew it was their best chance to escape detection. They followed the stream for several hundred yards before climbing out on the opposite bank and continuing northward. As full darkness descended, the temperature plummeted further. Eleanor began to worry that exposure might claim them before they could reach safety. Just as desperation began to set in, they glimpsed light through the trees ahead. Not the moving lights of lanterns, but the steady glow of electric lights. They had reached the main road, or perhaps a farmhouse on the outskirts of society property. Approaching cautiously, they found themselves at the edge of a cleared area surrounding a modest cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a truck was parked near the front door. It wasn't the main road as Eleanor had hoped, but it represented their first chance at assistance. "Stay here," Eleanor whispered, positioning Catherine behind a large tree at the forest's edge. "I'll approach alone. If anything happens to me, run along the tree line until you reach the road, then follow it away from Millbrook." Catherine clutched her mother's hand. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, her voice small. Eleanor embraced her daughter quickly. "I'll be right back. Watch for my signal to join me." She removed Richard's hunting knife from her pocket and pressed it into Catherine's hand. "Just in case," she added, though the thought of her young daughter needing to defend herself made her heart constrict. Eleanor approached the cabin openly, not wanting to appear threatening to whoever might be inside. She had nearly reached the front door when it opened, spilling warm light onto the snow. A man of about 60 stood in the doorway, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. "That's far enough," he called. "State your business." Eleanor raised her hands slightly. "My daughter and I are lost in the woods. We need help, a telephone if you have one." The man studied her for a moment, then gestured with the shotgun. "You from that religious group up in the hills? Millbrook, they call it?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but we're leaving. There are people looking for us. Please, my daughter is freezing." The man's expression remained suspicious, but he lowered the shotgun slightly. "I know about your group. Keep to yourselves mostly." "Odd bunch. Why would they be chasing you?" "Because they hurt children," Eleanor said bluntly, deciding that the direct truth was her only option. "They take children who don't fit their idea of purity and they kill them. They were going to take my daughter today. Please, she's just 11 years old." Something in her desperate tone must have convinced him. The man lowered his shotgun completely and stepped back from the doorway. "Bring your girl and come inside. Quickly." Eleanor turned and waved to Catherine, who emerged from her hiding place and ran to her mother's side. The man ushered them into the cabin, closing and locking the door behind them. The warmth inside was immediate and overwhelming after hours in the winter cold. "My name's Frank Miller," the man said, moving to stoke the fire in the stone fireplace. "I've lived on this property for 30 years, long before your group bought the land to the south. You two look half frozen. Sit by the fire while I get some blankets." Eleanor guided Catherine to the hearth, removing their wet shoes and helping her daughter out of her damp coat. Frank returned with wool blankets, which they wrapped around themselves gratefully. He disappeared into another room and returned with 2 mugs of hot coffee, handing one to Eleanor and offering the other to Catherine. "It's strong," he warned the girl, "but it'll warm you from the inside." Catherine accepted the mug with a polite "thank you," cradling it in her hands for warmth before taking a tentative sip. Her face contorted at the bitter taste, but she took another drink, clearly appreciating the warmth if not the flavor. Frank pulled a chair up across from them, his weathered face grave. "Now, tell me more about what you're running from. You said they kill children? That's a serious accusation." Eleanor nodded, keeping her voice low, though she knew they couldn't be overheard. "For generations, they've been selecting children during the winter ceremony. Children with birthmarks, red hair, or those who ask too many questions. They tell the parents these children are sent away for special cleansing, but they're actually—" She glanced at Catherine, who was staring into the fire, and left the sentence unfinished. Frank's expression darkened. "I've wondered about that place for years. People in town talk sometimes. Children who disappear, families who try to leave and never make it. The local sheriff won't investigate, says it's a private religious community and not his business unless someone files a formal complaint." "Would you have a telephone we could use?" Eleanor asked. "We need to contact the state police, someone outside the local authorities." Frank shook his head. "No telephone. Nearest one is at Wilson's General Store, about 7 miles down the road. He glanced out the window at the darkness. I could drive you in the morning. Too dangerous tonight with the snow and ice, especially if there are people searching for you. Eleanor felt a mix of relief and continued anxiety. They had found temporary shelter, but they were still too close to Millbrook, and the night would give the society time to organize a more thorough search. "Will we be safe here until morning?" "I keep to myself," Frank said, getting up to check that the curtains were drawn. "Most folks from Millbrook avoid my property. Had a dispute with your Reverend Morris years back over the property line, but just in case, I think you two should sleep in the root cellar tonight. It's comfortable enough with some bedding, and no one would think to look there." Catherine had remained silent during this exchange, but now she looked up at Frank with solemn eyes. "Did you know a boy named Joseph Miller?" she asked suddenly. "He would be older now. He was taken for cleansing when I was very young." Frank's face went completely still, and Eleanor saw something flash in his eyes. Recognition, then a deep, old pain. "Why do you ask about that name?" Eleanor reached for Catherine's hand, suddenly understanding. "Miller, you're related to him, aren't you?" Frank nodded slowly. "My grandson. My daughter and her husband joined your community 20 years ago against my advice. Joseph was born there." He turned away, his shoulders tight. "They told my daughter he'd been sent away for special religious training. She believed them. She still does." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered, the weight of the society's decades of deception pressing down on her. How many families had been torn apart? How many children had been sacrificed to maintain what Reverend Morris called purity? "They're going to keep doing it," Catherine said, her young voice surprisingly steady. "Every year they choose children. They're probably choosing someone else right now since I escaped." Frank turned back to them, his expression resolute. "Then we can't wait until morning. Those state troopers need to get up there now, tonight." "But you said the roads," Eleanor began, "are dangerous." "Yes," Frank finished, "but I've driven them in worse conditions." He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a heavy flashlight and what appeared to be a map. "We'll leave in 10 minutes. Get your shoes dried by the fire as best you can." As Frank prepared for their departure, Eleanor held Catherine close, both of them still wrapped in blankets before the fire. The immediate danger wasn't past. It wouldn't be until they were far from Millbrook with authorities intervening. But for the first time since discovering the journal, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. They had escaped, found an ally, and might yet save other children from the fate that had claimed so many over the years. "Mother," Catherine whispered, her head resting against Eleanor's shoulder, "what will happen to Father? Will he be in trouble for helping us?" Eleanor hadn't allowed herself to think about Richard since their escape. Her husband had been too ill to flee with them, yet he had ensured she found the evidence needed to understand the danger. She hoped the society would assume he knew nothing of their escape, that his illness was genuine and not a cover. But she also knew the elders' suspicion would fall on him immediately. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but your father wanted us to be safe. That's why he showed me the truth. We'll ask the state police to check on him when they go to Millbrook." Catherine nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer, though Eleanor suspected her daughter understood more than she expressed. The society had trained its children to keep their deepest thoughts private, a survival mechanism in a community where questioning could be fatal. Frank returned, now wearing a heavy coat and carrying additional blankets. "The truck's warming up," he said. "We'll wrap the girl in these for the drive. The heater works, but it's still going to be cold." They quickly prepared for departure, Eleanor and Catherine pulling on their still damp shoes and accepting additional layers of clothing from Frank's limited supply. As they were about to leave, Frank removed a shotgun from a rack by the door and loaded it methodically. "Just in case," he said, echoing Eleanor's earlier words to Catherine. "Folks who burn children aren't likely to give up their ways without a fight." The drive to Wilson's General Store was tense and uncomfortable. Frank's truck navigated the snow-covered road slowly, its headlights illuminating only a short distance ahead in the swirling darkness. Catherine sat between Frank and Eleanor in the truck's cab, wrapped in blankets and dozing against her mother's side, despite the circumstances. Eleanor remained vigilant, watching the road behind them whenever they rounded a bend, half expecting to see the lights of vehicles from Millbrook in pursuit. Wilson's store was closed when they arrived, but lights shone from the residence attached to the back of the building. Frank pounded on the door until a middle-aged man in a robe appeared, initially annoyed but quickly sobering when Frank explained the situation in terse, urgent terms. They were ushered inside to use the telephone, while Mrs. Wilson made fresh coffee and found dry socks for Catherine. The state police were initially skeptical of Eleanor's story, particularly given the late hour and the remote location. But Frank's corroborating statement about his grandson, combined with Eleanor's detailed knowledge of the society's practices and records, eventually convinced them to send officers to investigate. They were told to remain at the store until troopers could meet them there, a process that might take several hours given the weather conditions and their distance from the nearest state police barracks. As they waited, Eleanor found herself experiencing a strange mixture of emotions: relief at their escape, fear for Richard and the other families still in Millbrook, and a growing sense of unreality about the life she had left behind. How had she lived for so many years within a community capable of such atrocities? How had generations of families been complicit, whether through active participation or willing ignorance? "You couldn't have known," Frank said quietly, seeming to read her thoughts as they sat at the Wilsons' kitchen table. Catherine had finally given in to exhaustion and was sleeping on a cot in the corner, Mrs. Wilson having fussed over her with grandmotherly concern until she was comfortable. Cults like that. They work by making everything seem normal, even the terrible things. "But the signs were there," Eleanor replied, staring into her coffee cup. "Children disappearing, the secrecy, the fear of questioning. We all chose not to see." "My daughter still doesn't see," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even after Joseph was taken, she defended them, said I couldn't understand their ways because I wasn't one of them." "That's how deep it goes." Eleanor nodded, understanding too well the power of the society's conditioning. "Will she ever forgive you for helping us expose them?" Frank's expression was grim, but resolved. "Maybe not, but if it saves even one child from what happened to Joseph, I can live with that." The state police arrived just before dawn, two serious-faced troopers who interviewed Eleanor thoroughly before radioing for additional officers and a search warrant. By mid-morning, a small convoy of police vehicles was making its way toward Millbrook, with Eleanor accompanying them to identify key locations and individuals. Catherine remained at the Wilsons' store under Frank's protective watch, the girl extracting a promise from her mother to return as soon as possible. What the state police found at Millbrook would later be described in newspaper articles as a scene from another century. The entire community was gathered in the stone hall, the winter cleansing having continued through the night as the elders searched for alternatives to the traditional sacrifice. In the basement room, officers discovered the remains of a recently used fire pit, bone fragments, and several sets of small shackles mounted to the stone walls. Records dating back to 1873 detailed each cleansing with the names of children sacrificed and the impurities for which they had been selected. Reverend Morris, by then in his 90s and barely conscious of the proceedings, was taken into custody along with his son Nathaniel and the 4 other elders who had most recently conducted the ceremonies. Many of the community members, particularly the younger ones, appeared genuinely shocked by the revelations, having truly believed in the story of transfers to a sister community. Others, especially those who had lost children, responded with a complex mixture of grief, denial, and anger. Some directed at the authorities, but much of it turned inward as the full weight of their complicity became clear. Richard Winters was found in his home, severely beaten but alive. Eleanor learned that after her escape had been discovered, Nathaniel Morris and two other men had gone directly to the Winters home, assuming Richard had helped plan their flight. Despite his illness, Richard had been dragged to the community hall for questioning. His refusal to reveal where Eleanor might have gone had resulted in the beating, which might have been worse had the arrival of state police not interrupted the interrogation. The aftermath of what newspapers called the Millbrook Horror unfolded over the following months. Trials were held for the elders, resulting in multiple life sentences for murder and child endangerment. The community itself was dissolved, its property eventually sold, and the proceeds established as a trust for the surviving victims and families. Many former members required extensive counseling to process the truth of what had happened and their role in it, however unwitting. For Eleanor, Richard and Catherine, rebuilding a life outside the society proved both liberating and challenging. They relocated to a small town nearly 100 miles from Millbrook, where Richard slowly recovered from his injuries and found work as a bookkeeper. Catherine attended public school for the first time, her natural intelligence flourishing in an environment that encouraged questions rather than punishing them. Eleanor worked with state authorities for nearly 2 years, helping to identify victims and providing testimony that helped convict the elders. The Winters family maintained contact with Frank Miller, whose relationship with his daughter remained strained, but was slowly healing as she came to terms with the truth about her son's fate. Frank became something of a surrogate grandfather to Catherine, his gruff exterior softening whenever the girl visited with her incessant questions and bright curiosity. In the spring of 1948, a small memorial was erected on the former Millbrook property, bearing the names of 73 children identified as victims of the Society's cleansing rituals between 1873 and 1946. The true number was likely higher, as many records had been destroyed by elders in the chaotic hours before their arrest. Eleanor, Richard, and Catherine attended the dedication ceremony, along with several dozen former community members and relatives of the victims. As they stood before the simple stone marker, Catherine, now 13 and growing into a thoughtful young woman, asked a question that had no easy answer. Why did they do it, Mother? Why did they think burning children would keep them pure? Eleanor had pondered this question countless times since their escape. Fear, she said finally, fear of difference, fear of questioning, fear of change. Once they convinced themselves that certain traits were impure, sacrificing children seemed justified to protect the community. And over time, the ritual itself became more important than the reason behind it. But you questioned it, Catherine pointed out. You and Father both did. Eleanor glanced at Richard, who stood silently beside them, his face bearing the faint scars of his ordeal. Love is stronger than fear, she said simply. Love makes you brave enough to see the truth, even when it's terrible. The Society of Eternal Purity had maintained its hold through isolation and the manipulation of faith, twisting genuine religious belief into a weapon that claimed dozens of innocent lives over 7 decades. Its legacy lived on not only in the trauma of survivors and victims' families, but in the cautionary lessons it offered about the dangers of unquestioning obedience and the ease with which human beings could normalize even the most horrific practices when they were sanctioned by authority figures. Years later, historians and psychologists would study the Millbrook case as an example of how isolated communities could develop extreme practices that outsiders would immediately recognize as abhorrent, but which insiders accepted as normal. They would note the careful way the society had maintained a respectable facade for government inspectors while conducting their real activities in secret, and how the community's geographic isolation had prevented closer scrutiny. For Eleanor, the most important legacy was Catherine herself, bright, questioning, and alive. On Catherine's 18th birthday in 1953, Eleanor gave her daughter a journal, its pages blank except for an inscription on the first page. Ask questions. Seek truth. Remember, Catherine would go on to study psychology and eventually work with survivors of similar closed communities, her own experience informing her compassionate approach to helping others rebuild their lives after escaping systems of control and abuse. The site where Millbrook once stood eventually returned to forest, nature reclaiming the stone foundations and overgrown paths. Only the memorial remained, visited occasionally by the curious or by relatives of those who had been lost. The Society's records were sealed by court order, available only to researchers with specific clearance and to the families of victims seeking closure. In 1968, an academic study of the Millbrook case included interviews with several former members, by then elderly and long removed from their time in the community. One common thread emerged from these conversations. Many expressed that they had experienced moments of doubt about the Society's practices, particularly regarding the children who disappeared, but had suppressed these doubts out of fear or an unwillingness to question tradition. As one former member put it, we chose not to see what was in front of us. We chose our comfort over their lives. That's something I'll carry until my own death. Eleanor Winters died in 1974, having lived to see Catherine married with children of her own. Children raised to question everything and to view difference not as impurity, but as strength. Richard had preceded her in death by several years, the injuries he sustained during his beating having contributed to ongoing health issues. At Eleanor's funeral, Catherine spoke of her mother's courage and the lives saved by her willingness to confront a terrible truth rather than remain comfortably complicit. The story of the Society of Eternal Purity and its ritualistic sacrifice of children might have faded entirely from public memory, had it not been for Catherine's continued work with cult survivors and her eventual memoir, published in 1965. The book, titled The Winter Cleansing, brought renewed attention to the case and served as a warning about the dangers of isolated communities operating without oversight or accountability. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Millbrook case was how ordinary its members had been. Not monsters, but regular people who had allowed themselves to participate in monstrous acts through gradual acceptance of increasingly extreme beliefs. As Catherine wrote in the conclusion of her memoir, evil rarely announces itself with horns and a pitchfork. More often it comes in the form of small compromises, comfortable silences, and the steady erosion of our willingness to question what we're told is necessary or right. The most dangerous phrase in any language isn't a call to violence, it's, "We've always done it this way." In the quiet forests of upstate New York, where the community of Millbrook once stood, little remains to mark its existence beyond the memorial stone and the whispered stories still told by locals. Yet its legacy continues in the work of those who study how good people can be led to participate in terrible acts, and in the ongoing efforts to identify and intervene in similar isolated communities before more innocent lives are lost. For those who survived Millbrook and similar groups, the journey toward healing often began with the same step Eleanor had taken on that snowy December day in 1946. The courage to question, to see the truth behind comfortable lies, and to act even when the cost of action seemed impossibly high. In that sense, while the Society of Eternal Purity had sought to eliminate questioning as impurity, it was precisely that impurity that ultimately brought light to its darkest secrets and ended its reign of terror after 73 years of unchallenged control.